Easy now. Let me help you. It's gonna be all right, brother.
There are confessions that never leave the wooden booth, and there are truths that echo longer than any prayer. I am Father Thomas Brennan, and for 9 years I served at St. Michael's Chapel in the Cascade Range of Washington State, a small stone mission built in 1947 for loggers and their families, perched at 4,200 feet where the Douglas firs grow so thick that noon feels like dusk. The chapel stood alone, 3 miles from the nearest road, accessible only by foot or horseback. It was meant to be a place of solitude and devotion. It became something else entirely. It began in the autumn of 2014, on a Tuesday morning when the first snow dusted the ridgeline. I was splitting firewood behind the chapel when I heard it, a low, guttural sound that seemed to rise from the earth itself, neither animal nor wind. I stopped mid-swing. The forest had gone silent. No birds, no squirrels, just that sound, rolling through the trees like distant thunder. I found the first sign an hour later, a handprint pressed into the mud beside the creek, longer than my forearm, 4 fingers splayed wide. The edges were still wet. I knelt there for a long time, rosary beads cold between my fingers, trying to reconcile what I saw with what I believed possible. I had been a priest for 23 years. I had counseled the dying, baptized the newborn, and buried the faithful. I thought I understood the boundaries of creation. I was wrong. Over the following weeks, the signs multiplied. Saplings bent into careful arches, stones stacked in cairns near the chapel door. And then, on a November night when freezing rain turned the forest to glass, I saw her, a figure moving through the trees with impossible grace, 8 feet tall, shoulders broad as a doorway, covered in dark fur that glistened with ice. She paused at the clearing's edge, close enough that I could see her breath misting in the cold. Our eyes met. In that moment I understood. She was studying me just as I was studying her. She was not a monster. She was not a myth. She was a mother, and she was asking for help. My days at St. Michael's followed a rhythm unchanged since my arrival. Morning prayers at dawn, maintenance work until noon, study and reflection in the afternoon, evening mass for whoever made the trek up the mountain, usually no one. The isolation suited me. After years serving urban parishes where every moment demanded performance, the silence of the high country felt like grace itself. The chapel consisted of 3 rooms: the sanctuary, with its 12 wooden pews, my quarters in the back, and a root cellar dug into the mountainside for storing supplies. The diocese sent provisions monthly by mule train: flour, canned goods, kerosene, communion wine. I supplemented with trout from the creek and wild mushrooms I'd learned to identify. It was a simple life, anchored by routine and prayer. The Cascade ecosystem here is ancient and unforgiving. Black bears move through in late summer, fattening on huckleberries. Mountain lions leave scratch marks on the bark. Roosevelt elk winter in the lower valleys. I learned to read the forest the way I once read scripture. Every broken branch, every disturbed moss patch told a story. After 2 years, I could walk the 3 miles to the Forest Service road blindfolded. But nothing in my training as a naturalist or theologian prepared me for what I found that November. The handprint by the creek was just the beginning. Within days, I discovered tracks, bipedal, 5-toed, pressed deep into the soft earth along the game trails. Stride length nearly 6 feet. Weight, I could only guess, but the impressions suggested something massive. I documented everything in my journal, sketching the prints with careful measurements, noting the dates and weather conditions. The stacked stones appeared overnight, 7 cairns arranged in a semicircle 30 yards from the chapel, each about 3 feet high. The stones were smooth river rock, carried from the creek bed. Someone, something, had placed them with deliberate care. I dismantled them once. 2 nights later they returned, rebuilt in exactly the same positions. I should have been afraid. Instead, I felt curiosity, and something deeper, recognition. Whoever built these cairns understood symbolism, pattern, intention. These were not the random actions of an animal. This was communication. The first vocalization came on a Wednesday evening during Vespers. I was alone in the sanctuary, chanting the Psalms, when I heard it through the open window. A series of low, resonant knocks, wood on wood, rhythmic and purposeful. 3 beats, pause, 3 beats, pause, 3 beats. The pattern of a heartbeat, or a knock on a door. I stopped mid-verse and walked outside. The knocking ceased. The forest held its breath. "Hello?" My voice sounded small against the vastness of the trees. No response. But in the fading light I saw movement. A shadow detaching from the tree line, impossibly tall, moving with fluid silence deeper into the forest. I stood there until full dark, hands trembling, mind racing through possibilities. Mass hallucination brought on by isolation? Some elaborate hoax by bored locals? But the nearest town was 18 miles away, and the locals avoided the high country in winter. The logging roads were already snowed in. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lit candles in the sanctuary and opened my Bible to Genesis. And God said, "Let the earth bring forth the living creature after his kind, cattle and creeping thing, and beast of the earth after his kind." And it was so. What if God's creation was wider than I'd imagined? What if there were still beasts of the earth we hadn't cataloged, hadn't named, hadn't destroyed? The questions kept me awake until dawn. Over the next 2 weeks, the encounters intensified. I found bundles of wild garlic left on the chapel steps, carefully arranged, tied with strips of cedar bark. I found a trout, gutted and cleaned, placed on a flat rock by the well. These were gifts, offerings. The anthropologist in me recognized reciprocity behavior, the building blocks of social exchange. I began leaving offerings of my own, apples from my winter stores, hardtack bread, once a wool blanket I could spare. Each morning, they were gone. Then came the night I saw her clearly. A full moon turned the snow to silver. I was drawing water from the well when I heard footsteps, heavy, measured, approaching from the north trail. I froze, bucket in hand. She emerged from the shadow of the trees, and in the moonlight I could see every detail. The auburn-brown fur, darker on the back and shoulders. The pronounced brow ridge over eyes that caught the light with an almost human intelligence. The way she moved, not lumbering but deliberate, each step placed with careful awareness. She stopped 20 feet away. We stared at each other across the snow. She was breathing hard, small clouds of vapor pulsing into the cold air. Her right arm hung at an odd angle, and even from that distance I could see the dark matting of blood on her forearm. She was injured. Slowly, carefully, I set down the bucket. I raised both hands, palms open, the universal gesture of peace. She watched me for what felt like an eternity. Then she made a sound, soft, almost questioning, not threatening, asking, "You're hurt," I said quietly, though I didn't know if she could understand language. "I can help, if you'll let me." She didn't move closer, but she didn't leave either. I took one step toward the chapel, then looked back. She was still watching. "I'll get supplies," I said. "I'll leave them here, for you." When I returned 5 minutes later with my first aid kit and antiseptic, she was gone. But the next morning, the bandages I'd left were missing, and there were fresh tracks leading deeper into the mountains. The relationship had begun. By December, I had established a fragile protocol. 3 times a week, I left medical supplies in a weatherproof box behind the root cellar. Bandages, antiseptic, pain medication from my own meager stock, antibiotic ointment. The supplies always disappeared overnight. In exchange, I'd find offerings. Pine cones arranged in geometric patterns, unusual stones with fossil imprints, once an entire elk shoulder, still fresh, far more meat than I could use. I documented everything in a separate journal, hidden beneath a loose floorboard in my quarters. Scientific observation mixed with theological questioning. What did it mean that God had kept this species hidden? Was their concealment divine protection? A final remnant of wilderness that humanity hadn't corrupted? And what was my role, my responsibility, in this encounter? The injury I eventually deduced was a deep laceration, probably from barbed wire or a rusty trap left by illegal hunters. I could track her recovery through the evidence. The first week, spots of blood on the snow. The second week, less blood, more mobility in the tracks. By the third week, the normal stride pattern had returned. But I also realized she wasn't alone. The tracks multiplied. Smaller prints appeared alongside hers. Juvenile, perhaps 8 or 9 years old based on the size. And occasionally, much larger prints, adult male, with a stride that spoke of immense power, a family group. The thought filled me with equal parts wonder and dread. Where did they shelter? How did they survive the winters? What was their population? Were there others? I began ranging further from the chapel during my daily walks, mapping the territory, looking for signs of habitation. I found nothing definitive, no dens, no permanent structures. They were nomadic, or they were extraordinarily skilled at concealment. Probably both. Then the first snowstorm of the season trapped me inside for 4 days. When it cleared, I found something that changed everything. A message. On the chapel's south wall, where the wood was smooth and weathered, someone had drawn symbols using charcoal from my own fire pit. Not random marks. Deliberate pictographs. A stick figure representing a human. A larger figure, clearly representing them. Between the figures, a circle. Inside the circle, smaller figures. Children. My hands shook as I copied the images into my journal. This was proof of abstract thinking, symbolic communication, family structure. This was evidence that would revolutionize anthropology, biology, our understanding of human evolution itself. This was also a plea. They were showing me their family. They were asking me to understand. They had young ones. They were vulnerable. They needed protection. I stood before that wall for an hour, breath misting in the cold, weighing the impossible decision before me. I could report this to the diocese, to the authorities, to the scientific community. I could become famous, the priest who proved the impossible. Research teams would flood these mountains. Cameras, helicopters, tranquilizer guns. These beings would be captured, studied, cataloged. Their habitat would be destroyed. Their privacy, their very existence, would be monetized and exploited. Or I could keep the secret. I chose silence. God forgive me, I chose silence. That night I added my own drawing to the wall. A simple cross, and beneath it 2 words in large letters. You're safe. The communication evolved from there. She, I began thinking of her as Sarah, though I never spoke the name aloud, began leaving more complex arrangements. 3 pine cones beside the well meant she needed supplies. A single white stone on the chapel step meant all was well, no danger. A broken branch across the trail meant stay away. Something wrong. Give space. I learned to read the language of the forest as filtered through her intelligence. When ravens gathered in unusual numbers, she was moving through nearby. When the chickadees fell silent mid-morning, she was watching from the ridge. She was teaching me to see the world through her eyes. A world where humans were the unpredictable threat, where survival meant constant vigilance, where every sound could mean discovery and death. In January, I met the child. I was checking the supply box when I heard a soft chittering sound. Curious, not aggressive. I turned slowly. Standing at the edge of the clearing, partially concealed behind a massive cedar, was a juvenile, perhaps 4 feet tall, covered in lighter brown fur with enormous dark eyes that studied me with uninhibited fascination. "Hello?" I whispered. The young one tilted its head, mimicking the gesture I'd made. Then it took 1 tentative step forward. "It's okay," I said, keeping my voice low and calm. "I'm a friend." Behind the cedar, I caught movement. Sarah, watching intently, ready to intervene if I posed any threat. This was a test. She was teaching her child that I was safe, that this place was refuge. The juvenile approached to within 10 feet, then squatted on its haunches, still watching me with those intelligent eyes. I sat down in the snow, making myself smaller, less threatening. We stayed like that for perhaps 5 minutes, simply regarding each other. Then Sarah made a soft vocalization, 2 low grunts, and the young one immediately retreated. They melted into the forest together, leaving only tracks. I sat in the snow for a long time after, tears freezing on my cheeks. I had been trusted with something sacred. A mother had shown me her child. In that moment, the boundary between human and other, between known and unknown, between civilization and wilderness, all of it dissolved. They weren't monsters lurking in the dark. They were people, different people, people of the forest, but people nonetheless, with families, with language, with trust and fear and hope. And I was now their keeper, their priest, in a way the church had never intended. The weight of that responsibility would define everything that followed. February brought a cold snap that pushed temperatures to 15 below zero. I burned through firewood at an alarming rate, keeping the chapel just warm enough to prevent the communion wine from freezing. The creek iced over completely. Elk moved down to lower elevations. I worried about Sarah and her family. Where were they sheltering? Were they warm enough? Did they have adequate food? My answer came on Valentine's Day of all days. I woke before dawn to the sound of distress, a low, keening cry that raised every hair on my body. It came from the north, from the direction of Widow's Peak, a granite outcrop about a mile up the ridge. The sound continued, rhythmic and anguished, like grief itself given voice. I dressed quickly, grabbed my pack with medical supplies, and headed into the darkness with only my headlamp and the certainty that something was terribly wrong. The climb took 40 minutes through knee-deep snow. The keening grew louder as I approached, joined now by other sounds: grunts, shuffling, the crack of breaking wood. I killed my headlamp 50 yards out and let my eyes adjust to the pre-dawn darkness. What I saw stopped my heart. A natural cave in the granite face, partially concealed by a fallen Douglas fir, and outside the cave, Sarah, pacing in frantic circles, that terrible keening pouring from her throat. Inside the cave, visible in the growing light, I could see movement. Multiple figures, large and small. Then I understood. She wasn't alone. This was the family den, and someone inside was in trouble. I approached slowly, making noise so I wouldn't startle her. She spun toward me, and for the first time I saw genuine fear in her eyes. She gestured, a remarkably human motion, toward the cave entrance, asking for help, begging for it. "I'm here," I said. "Show me." She led me to the entrance. I had to crouch to enter, and the smell hit me immediately. The musk of the family, yes, but also something else. Infection, fever, sickness. Inside, the cave opened into a larger space, perhaps 12 feet across, the floor lined with moss, cedar boughs, and what looked like stolen wool blankets, probably from summer cabins. In the corner, a massive male, easily 9 feet tall, lay on his side, breathing in labored gasps. The young one I'd met before huddled against him, making small, frightened sounds. The male's left leg was grotesquely swollen, the fur matted with pus and blood. I could see the entry wound, a bullet hole high on the thigh. Some hunter's shot, probably weeks old, now infected and septic. Sarah made a sound, urgent, demanding. "Okay," I said, though my mind was racing. "Okay, let me see. I'd taken a battlefield medicine course years ago, back when I considered becoming a military chaplain. But this was beyond anything I'd trained for. This was veterinary medicine, wilderness surgery, and prayer all rolled into one impossible situation. I unpacked my supplies: antiseptic, gauze, a half bottle of vodka I'd been saving for communion wine, a folding knife sterilized with a lighter, and a bottle of amoxicillin I'd been prescribed months ago for bronchitis but never finished. "I need to drain the wound," I said, speaking to Sarah as if she could understand every word, and perhaps she could. "It's going to hurt him. He might react. Can you keep him calm?" She positioned herself at his head, placing her massive hands on either side of his face, leaning close. She made a series of soft, rhythmic vocalizations. Comfort sounds, I realized. Reassurance. I went to work. The bullet was still in there, lodged against the femur. I could feel it through the swollen tissue. Using the knife, I reopened the wound, letting the infection drain. The male groaned, a sound that shook the cave walls, but Sarah held him steady. I irrigated with vodka, the most sterile thing I had. Then, working by feel and headlamp, I used the knife tip to extract the bullet fragment. It took 20 minutes. The male lost consciousness halfway through, which was a mercy. When I finally pulled the bullet free, a .30-06 rifle round, copper-jacketed, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly collapsed. I packed the wound with antibiotic ointment, administered 6 amoxicillin pills by crushing them and mixing with water, hoping his system could process them, and dressed the leg with every bandage I had. "He needs rest," I told Sarah. "Warmth, water. I'll bring more medicine tomorrow." She looked at me then with an expression I'll never forget. Exhaustion, gratitude, and something deeper. Recognition. We were no longer stranger and unknown. We were healers together, working to save a life. The juvenile approached me shyly as I packed up my supplies and gently touched my hand with one finger. The gesture was so delicate, so human, that I nearly wept. "You're welcome," I whispered. I left them there in the cave as the sun broke over the ridge, painting the snow gold and pink. My hands were covered in blood. Not human blood, but blood nonetheless. Sacred blood, because all life is sacred. At the cave entrance, I turned back. Sarah stood silhouetted against the morning light, one hand raised in what could only be interpreted as farewell, or blessing. I raised my hand in return. "God keep you," I said. The forest seemed to hold its breath. Then she vanished back into the cave, and I began the long walk back to the chapel. I had crossed a line. I was no longer merely observing these beings. I was intervening in their survival. I was protecting them actively, medically, intentionally. I was sheltering them, and I knew with absolute certainty that there would be a price for this. The male, I began calling him Joshua in my mind, though I never spoke it aloud. Survived. Over the next 3 weeks, I made the trek to the cave every other day, bringing antibiotics, clean water, dried meat, apples from my stores. Each visit, the swelling diminished. The infection retreated. His eyes, initially glazed with fever, grew clear and alert. He never showed fear of me. From the beginning, he seemed to understand I was there to help. Once, when I was changing his bandages, he reached out and touched my shoulder. Gentle, deliberate, a gesture of thanks that transcended species. Sarah allowed me to examine the juvenile as well, a female, I determined, with small hands and a lighter bone structure. She was healthy, curious, and increasingly comfortable with my presence. She began following me on my walks, staying 20 yards back, mimicking my movements. When I stopped to examine a track, she stopped. When I knelt to drink from a stream, she knelt. She was learning, playing, treating me like a strange but acceptable addition to her world. I taught her a game. I'd stack stones. She'd knock them down. Simple, but it delighted her. Her laughter, and it was laughter, a chittering, joyful sound, echoed through the forest. But even as I fell deeper into this extraordinary relationship, the outside world began to encroach. In March, the diocese sent Father Rodriguez for a routine inspection. He arrived on a Thursday afternoon, riding up with the supply mule, carrying letters from the bishop and a new shipment of communion wafers. "You look thin, Thomas," he said, unpacking in the sanctuary. "Are you eating enough?" "The winter was hard," I replied, which was true enough. He stayed 2 days. I was careful. No visits to the cave, no leaving supplies, no drawings on the wall. I'd covered Sarah's pictographs with a hanging tapestry. But Rodriguez was observant. He noticed the missing medical supplies, the depleted antibiotic stock, the unusual amount of food I'd gone through. "Are you treating someone?" he asked on the second evening, over a simple dinner of beans and bread. "The isolation takes a toll," I said carefully. "I've had some minor ailments." He studied me with eyes that had heard 1,000 confessions. "Thomas, if you're struggling with your vocation, if the solitude is too much, there's no shame in requesting reassignment. The bishop would understand." "I'm not struggling," I said, and realized it was true. I'd never felt more certain of my purpose. After he left, I found a note tucked into my Bible. "Whatever you're protecting up here, be careful. The church has never been kind to secrets." He knew. Maybe not the details, but he knew something was happening. That night, I lay awake in my quarters, staring at the ceiling beams, weighing impossible choices. Keeping this secret was becoming unsustainable. The medical supplies alone would raise questions. And what happened when summer came? When hikers and researchers flooded the high country? How could I protect a family of beings who left 8-foot-tall tracks in the mud? The answer came from an unexpected source. In April, I met Marcus Webb, a wildlife biologist conducting a survey on wolverine populations. He appeared at the chapel on a rainy Tuesday, seeking shelter and a hot meal. We talked for hours. He was young, passionate, and refreshingly open-minded about the mysteries still hidden in the wilderness. "You know what terrifies me?" he said, nursing a cup of tea. "We're cataloging species extinction rates, and I think we're missing the point. It's not just about numbers. We're erasing entire mysteries before we even know they exist. There could be undiscovered megafauna in these mountains, remote valleys that haven't seen humans in centuries, and we're so busy counting the dying that we're not looking for the hidden." "What would you do?" I asked carefully. "If you discovered something extraordinary, something that would change our understanding of the natural world?" He was quiet for a long moment. "Honestly, I don't know. The scientist in me says document, publish, protect through awareness. But I've seen what awareness does. Research teams trampling nesting sites, photographers stressing wildlife for the perfect shot, poachers following scientific papers to find rare species." He shook his head. "Sometimes I think the kindest thing we can do is leave mysteries alone, even if it means never knowing the truth, especially then. Not all knowledge needs to be claimed." After he left, I added his name to my private journal, a potential ally if I ever needed one, someone who might understand. But the decision was taken out of my hands on May 10th. I was returning from the cave. Joshua was now walking with a limp but healing well, when I spotted fresh tire tracks on the Forest Service road, unusual for early May. I followed them to a staging area where I found 3 trucks, sophisticated camera equipment, and a team of 6 people setting up a base camp. The leader introduced himself as Derek Sutton, documentary filmmaker working on a series about cryptids. We have thermal imaging, trail cameras, audio equipment. We're going to prove once and for all if there's anything living in these mountains that shouldn't be. My blood ran cold. This is protected wilderness, I said. You need permits. Got 'em. He showed me the paperwork, all legitimate, authorized by the Forest Service for a 4-month study. 4 months. Right through summer when Sarah's family was most active, when the juvenile would be most playful and least cautious. Father, if you don't mind me asking, Sutton said, his eyes sharp. Have you seen anything unusual up here? Tracks, sounds, anything? I met his gaze and lied to his face. Nothing but bears and elk. You're wasting your time. But I knew, and perhaps he knew I knew, that time was running out. That night I knelt in the sanctuary and prayed not for guidance, but for forgiveness. Because I already knew what I had to do. I was going to lie. I was going to misdirect. I was going to do everything in my power to protect them, even if it meant betraying my vows. The documentary team's presence forced me to become someone I'd never been. A deceiver, a saboteur, a guardian operating in the shadows. I became intimate with their schedules, their methods, their blind spots. Sutton's team deployed 30 trail cameras across a 5-mile radius. I memorized every location. When they focused on the eastern ridges, I guided Sarah's family west. When they set up audio recording equipment in valleys where I'd heard vocalizations, I left offerings that drew the family away. Food caches placed strategically, scent markers using my own clothing. I became fluent in misdirection. When Sutton asked about the best places to look, I sent them toward dead zones, areas I knew the family avoided. When they asked about local legends, I told them stories about an abandoned mining camp on the far side of the range, 14 miles away. Half the team spent 2 weeks searching an area that had never seen anything but black bears. But the lies took their toll. Every morning at Mass, I recited the prayers by rote while my mind calculated trajectories and risks. Every evening, I wrote 2 journals, one for the church documenting my peaceful ministry in isolation, and one for myself, hidden beneath the floorboards, tracking the survival of a species that wasn't supposed to exist. Sarah understood the danger. I could see it in the way she moved now, more cautious, always checking sight lines, freezing at any mechanical sound. The juvenile stayed closer to her side. Joshua, still recovering, kept to the cave during daylight hours. The closest call came in late May. Sutton's team got thermal readings from Widow's Peak. Heat signatures too large to be human, moving on 2 legs. They planned a night surveillance operation at the cave entrance. I had 12 hours to relocate the family. I hiked to the cave at dusk. Sarah was immediately alert, sensing my distress. I couldn't explain with words, so I used the language we'd developed. Broken branches, stones arranged in warning patterns, and finally, a crude map drawn in the dirt showing the team's position and a route to safety. She understood within minutes. By the time I'd finished the drawing, she was already gathering their belongings. The stolen blankets, a collection of tools, rocks shaped for grinding, sharp stones for cutting, and something that stopped my heart, a small leather pouch I'd never seen before. She opened it carefully and showed me the contents. Inside, a river stone painted with ochre, a bird feather, a piece of quartz, and a folded piece of cloth that I recognized. A handkerchief I'd lost months ago, embroidered with my initials. These were treasures, precious objects. She was showing me that I mattered to them, that I had value beyond the supplies I brought. I touched the pouch gently, then closed her hand around it. You keep this safe, I whispered. All of you stay safe. We moved them that night. I led them through terrain I knew Sutton's team couldn't access. A game trail that required squeezing through narrow rock passages, crossing a creek at a point where the stones were slick and treacherous, finally reaching a small box canyon I'd discovered years ago. Hidden, defendable, with a spring for water and enough shelter for temporary habitation. Joshua struggled with his leg, but he made it. The juvenile stayed silent the entire journey, 6 miles through darkness, her small hand occasionally touching my pack for reassurance. At the canyon, I left them with all the supplies I could carry. 1 week, I said, holding up 7 fingers. Stay here 1 week, then I'll come get you when it's safe. Sarah nodded. Then she did something that shattered me. She placed her hand on my head, the way a priest gives a blessing, and made a soft, melodic sound. A prayer, perhaps, or a thank you, or a promise. I turned away quickly so they wouldn't see me cry. The thermal readings at the cave were dismissed as geological anomalies or bear den heat signatures. Sutton was frustrated but not deterred. His team expanded their search area. During that week, I had time to reflect on what I'd become. I thought of Peter denying Christ 3 times. I thought of Rahab hiding the Hebrew spies. I thought of every biblical figure who had to choose between truth and protection, between law and love. Father Rodriguez's words haunted me. The church has never been kind to secrets. But what was my true calling here? To serve institutional truth or to serve life itself? To report what I'd found and watch these beings be captured, studied, turned into specimens, or to protect them, to honor the trust they'd placed in me, to preserve the last mystery in a world that had cataloged everything else. On the 7th day, I brought them home to the cave. The documentary team had moved operations to the southern slopes. We had a reprieve, but I knew it was temporary. That night, sitting outside the cave while the family settled back into their home, I had what can only be called a theological crisis. I prayed, not the formal prayers of the liturgy, but the raw, desperate prayer of someone who has seen too much to maintain comfortable certainties. God, if this is wrong, show me. If I'm supposed to expose them, give me a sign. But if I'm supposed to protect them, give me strength. The answer came not in thunder or divine vision, but in a small moment. The juvenile emerging from the cave, approaching me shyly, and placing her head against my shoulder. Trusting, innocent, alive. In that moment, I understood. My vocation wasn't to the church as an institution, it was to the sacred itself. And the sacred was here, breathing, living, trusting me to choose love over protocol. I chose them, and I would keep choosing them, no matter the cost. The documentary team left in July empty-handed and frustrated. Sutton promised to return with better equipment, more funding, better prepared. I smiled and wished him well, knowing I'd have months to prepare countermeasures. But the real threat came from where I least expected it, the church itself. In August, Bishop Morrison made an unannounced visit, his first to St. Michael's in 7 years. He arrived with Father Rodriguez and 2 members of the Diocesan Finance Committee. They spent 3 days reviewing my records, inventories, expense reports. Your medical supply expenses have tripled, one committee member noted. Your food requisitions are far beyond what one person requires. Your maintenance budget shows equipment purchases that aren't present on the property. I offered explanations. Harsh winter conditions, supplies shared with occasional hikers, equipment stolen or lost. The lies came easier now, polished by months of practice. But Bishop Morrison wasn't interested in the numbers. On the 3rd evening, he asked Rodriguez and the committee members to leave us alone in the sanctuary. Thomas, he said quietly, I've been a bishop for 23 years. I've seen every kind of crisis a priest can face. Addiction, affairs, embezzlement, crises of faith. I know when a man is hiding something. Your Excellency, he held up his hand. I'm not here to accuse you. I'm here because I'm worried. Rodriguez thinks you're having a breakdown. The committee thinks you're running some kind of side operation. But I look at you, and I see something different. He paused. I see a man who's found a calling that terrifies him. The silence stretched between us. If I asked you directly what you're protecting, he said, what would you say? I could have lied again. Should have lied. But something in his eyes, a kindness I hadn't expected, broke through my defenses. I would say, I answered slowly, that there are forms of life in these mountains that deserve protection more than they deserve discovery, and that my vocation, as I understand it, is to be their guardian. Forms of life, yes, that aren't in any textbook, yes. He was quiet for a long time. The church would want documentation, proof, a formal report to scientific authorities. You understand that? I do. And you're refusing. I am. He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the darkening forest. When I was a young priest in Peru, I worked in the Amazon. There was a tribe, uncontacted, living deep in the protected reserve. Every few years, loggers would push closer to their territory. And every time my predecessor would lie to the authorities, would misdirect, would do everything he could to keep those loggers away. He turned back to me. He died, without ever meeting a single member of that tribe. Never knew if they were grateful or if they even knew he existed. Did you ever think he was wrong? Every day. And every day I was grateful someone had the courage to do what institutions can't. Hope flared in my chest. Your Excellency, I can give you 1 year, he interrupted. 1 year before the diocese requires a full accounting. Use that time to resolve your situation, however you see fit. He moved toward the door. then paused. But Thomas, understand. If this becomes public, if there's any scandal, any evidence that you've misused church resources or violated your vows, I won't be able to protect you. I understand. Do you? His expression was grave. Because they'll strip you of your collar. They'll call you delusional. Everything you've worked for your entire life in service to the church, it will end. I know. He studied me for a long moment. Then you're a braver man than I ever was. God keep you, Father Brennan. After he left, I sat in the empty sanctuary until dawn, the weight of his gift and his warning settling into my bones. 1 year, 365 days to find a permanent solution to an impossible problem. The summer brought tourists and hikers. I became a constant presence on the trails, friendly and helpful, always ready to redirect people away from the northern ridges. Better fishing in the South Valley. The views are more spectacular from Eagle Point. I heard there's been aggressive bear activity near Widow's Peak. Best to avoid that area. Most people accepted my guidance. A few didn't. I had to physically turn back 2 groups of teenagers who wanted to explore the haunted caves they'd heard about from local legends. Sarah's family adapted. They became almost completely nocturnal, moving only in darkness, sheltering in the cave or the box canyon during the day. The juvenile grew bolder, more coordinated. She was learning to hunt, to track, to survive. I saw less of her, which was good. She needed to be wild, not dependent on me, but the strain was showing on all of them. Sarah looked thinner. Joshua's limp wasn't healing as well as I'd hoped. The juvenile had less energy for play. In September, I made a decision. I wrote 2 letters. The first was to Marcus Webb, the wildlife biologist. I outlined everything, in careful coded language, and asked if he knew of any truly remote locations, places that could support a small population of large omnivores, places where human contact would be minimal for decades. The second was to an environmental law firm in Seattle. I asked about the process for establishing wildlife corridors, for protecting unspecified endangered species, for creating no-access wilderness zones. I didn't know if either letter would yield results, but I had to try something beyond just hiding and hoping, because the year Bishop Morrison gave me was already slipping away, and I knew, with terrible certainty, that when it was up, a choice would be forced upon me that would define the rest of my life. The response from Marcus Webb came in October, delivered by hand to avoid postal records. He arrived at the chapel on a gray afternoon, carrying a topographic map and questions in his eyes. "I'm not going to ask what you found," he said, spreading the map across my table, "but I'm going to tell you what I know. There have been sightings, tracks, vocalizations recorded by trail cameras. Whatever is in these mountains, other people are looking for it too." He pointed to a mark on the map, 200 miles north in British Columbia. Provincial government established a protected zone here last year. 20,000 acres, no logging, no development, limited access. Officially, it's for caribou habitat. He met my eyes. Unofficially, there were reports of anomalous large bipedal tracks. The rangers I talked to were very careful to say they'd found nothing conclusive, which tells me they found something extremely conclusive. Why are you telling me this? Because you're protecting something worth protecting, and because I think whatever you're sheltering is running out of time here. He was right. The documentary team had returned in September with a larger crew and better equipment. Local news had picked up the story. Bigfoot hunters returned to Cascades. The attention was growing, metastasizing. Soon it wouldn't be research teams. It would be tourists, thrill seekers, hunters wanting trophies. How would I, hypothetically, relocate a population that officially doesn't exist? I asked. Marcus smiled grimly, very carefully, and with help. Over the next month, we planned what could only be called an exodus. Marcus recruited 2 colleagues he trusted absolutely, both wildlife biologists, both familiar with large animal relocation, both willing to work without documentation or official sanction. They understood we were protecting something extraordinary. The route was ambitious. Cross the border through remote wilderness corridor, following river valleys and avoiding all roads, covering 200 miles of brutal terrain. It would take weeks. It would require supplies cached along the route, and it would require convincing Sarah's family to leave the only home they'd known. In November, I made the proposal. I couldn't explain with words, so I built a model, a map using stones, branches, and charcoal drawings. Here, the cave. Here, the growing danger. Here, the route north. Here, safety, space, isolation. Sarah studied it for hours, running her fingers over the paths I'd drawn, understanding the distances, the risks. Joshua watched silently. The juvenile, now nearly 5 feet tall, entering what I assumed was adolescence, looked frightened. Finally, Sarah made her decision. She took a stone from the safety area and placed it firmly on the cave marker. No, they would stay. I tried again, showing her the thermal cameras, the increased patrols, the shrinking space. She understood, but she placed the stone back. This was their home, they wouldn't leave. I returned to the chapel in despair, but that night I found something that changed everything. A fire had been set in the clearing, not by me, and gathered around it were others, 4 of them, adults, larger than Joshua, watching the chapel with patient curiosity. A second family, perhaps relatives, perhaps part of a larger network I'd never glimpsed. Sarah emerged from the forest and approached them. What followed was a communication I could barely comprehend. Vocalizations, gestures, posturing. A conversation. About me, I realized. About the danger. About the choice. By dawn, they had decided. Not all of them would go. Sarah's family would remain, committed to their territory. But the others, the 4 I'd never met, they would make the journey north, and the juvenile would go with them. The decision shattered me. Sarah was sending her child away to protect her. The sacrifice was almost unbearable to witness. The departure was set for December 1st during the new moon, when darkness would be deepest. Marcus and his team positioned themselves along the route with supplies and guidance. I spent the final week with Sarah's family, trying to memorize every detail, the way sunlight caught in the juvenile's fur, the rumbling sound Joshua made when content, the particular expression Sarah wore when she was thinking. On the last night, I held a service. Not a Catholic mass, but something older, more primal. I built a fire outside the cave. Sarah's family gathered. I read from Ecclesiastes. To everything there is a season, and a time to every purpose under heaven. A time to be born, and a time to die. A time to plant, and a time to pluck up that which is planted. I like to think they understood the solemnity, if not the words. The juvenile approached me before leaving. She placed something in my hand, a small carving, rough but deliberate, a figure that looked unmistakably like me, whittled from cedar. Then she wrapped her arms around me in an embrace that felt achingly human. Be safe, I whispered. Be wild. Be free. Sarah touched my face once, gently, a gesture of farewell that required no translation. Then they were gone, melting into the darkness with Marcus's team as guides, beginning a journey to a new home 200 miles away. I stood by the dying fire until dawn, knowing I would never see them again, knowing this was the right choice, knowing it was breaking my heart. Sarah and Joshua remained, but the forest felt emptier now. The game had changed. They were more vulnerable, but also more committed to staying hidden. Our encounters became rarer, more careful, but on my table, I kept the small carving, a priest rendered in cedar by hands that weren't human, proof of a relationship that had transcended every boundary. The year Bishop Morrison had given me was almost up, and I still had no answers, only deeper questions. But I had managed one small miracle. I had helped a family survive, some of them at least. In a world of noise and exploitation and constant exposure, I had preserved a fragment of mystery, and I would keep that secret until my last breath. The church came for me in March. Bishop Morrison called me to the diocesan office in Seattle. I made the journey knowing I would not return to St. Michael's. The interview lasted 4 hours. They had compiled evidence, supply discrepancies, testimony from hikers about my unusual behavior, reports from the documentary team about my obstruction of their work, and a formal complaint from the Forest Service about unauthorized trail closures. Father Brennan, Bishop Morrison said, his voice heavy with regret, we need you to explain what you were doing in those mountains. I could have told them everything, could have shown them my journals, my photographs of tracks, my medical records documenting the bullet I'd extracted. I could have given them proof that would have rewritten biology textbooks. Instead, I said, I was serving my congregation. You had no congregation up there. I did. They just weren't human. The room went silent. Father Rodriguez leaned forward. Thomas, are you claiming you were ministering to animals? I'm claiming that the line between human and animal is not as clear as we pretend it is, and that my vocation is to protect life, not classify it. They diagnosed me with isolation-induced delusion. prescribed psychiatric evaluation and mandatory leave. They were kind about it, emphasizing that I'd served faithfully for decades, that the isolation had simply been too much, that with treatment, I could return to ministry in a more suitable environment. I accepted their diagnosis without argument, let them think I'd lost my mind. It was easier than the truth. They assigned a new priest to St. Michael's, a young man named Father Chen, earnest and devoted. I met with him before he took over, gave him the keys, showed him the supply routes. One piece of advice, I said as we stood outside the chapel for the last time. If you see tracks you don't recognize or hear sounds that don't match any animal you know or find offerings you didn't leave, don't investigate. Don't report it. Just let it be. He looked at me with concern. Father Brennan, are you all right? I'm better than I've ever been, I said truthfully. I moved to a small parish in eastern Washington, far from the mountains. I say Mass for elderly parishioners, teach catechism to children, and maintain a quiet life. The church watches me carefully, waiting for another episode. I give them nothing to worry about. But every few months I receive a package. No return address, postmarked from British Columbia. Inside, a photograph of a forest scene carefully composed, and hidden in the background, if you know where to look, barely visible in the shadows. Figures, tall, unmistakable. Marcus's way of telling me the northern family is thriving, and sometimes late at night I receive emails from Father Chen. Brief, cryptic messages. Found an unusual arrangement of stones today. Heard vocalizations that didn't match any wildlife I know. Something left medical supplies at the back door. He's figured it out, and like me, he's chosen silence. Sarah and Joshua are still there, still protected, still wild. The juvenile is growing up in a safe territory, learning to be fully herself, unobserved and unclassified. The documentary team eventually gave up, dismissing the Cascade sightings as hoaxes and misidentifications. The world moved on. The mystery remained unsolved, exactly as it should be. People often ask me if I regret my decision, if I wish I'd come forward, claimed the scientific recognition, proved the impossible. The answer is always no, because I learned something in those mountains that no laboratory could teach me, that not all truth needs to be shouted from rooftops, that some knowledge is a burden we carry quietly, a sacred trust between us and the wild, that the highest calling isn't to discover and proclaim, but sometimes to encounter and protect. I think of the juvenile sometimes, wonder what kind of life she's living now. Does she remember the priest who played stone-stacking games with her? Does she still carry that leather pouch with its treasures? Has she told her own children about the strange, hairless being who brought medicine and asked nothing in return but trust? I like to think she does. I like to think that in whatever way her species carries memory and meaning, I'm there, a footnote in their oral history, the priest who kept the secret. On quiet evenings, I take out the cedar carving she made. I run my fingers over its rough surface, feeling the places where her hands shape the wood, and I pray, not for answers, not for vindication, just gratitude. Gratitude that I was trusted with something extraordinary. Gratitude that I was strong enough to protect it. Gratitude that in a world obsessed with exposing every mystery, dissecting every wonder, I got to preserve one fragment of the unknown. The church thinks I had a breakdown. The scientific community doesn't know I exist. History won't record my name. But somewhere in the mountains of British Columbia, a family lives that wouldn't exist if I'd chosen differently. A juvenile is now an adult, perhaps with young ones of her own. And they are wild, and hidden, and safe. That's enough. That's more than enough. Some truths belong to the forest. Some secrets are meant to be kept. And some vocations are measured not by what we reveal to the world, but by what we have the courage to conceal.